Is buying in the $400,000 mark still even possible in 2025?
If you have a low budget, you don't just buy in regional areas. It doesn't mean you need to abandon that city. You just need to abandon that type of asset.
And we're not just talking about buying anywhere in the 400s. We're talking about areas that are actually set for growth.
This house, $475,000. I would say after reno, it'd be worth around 570-ish mark.
So many BAs want to keep the areas they're buying in close to their chest, but we've managed to convince Simon Loo, founder of House Finder and property investor who's built a whopping portfolio, to reveal 6 key locations where you can still buy under market value, set for some serious growth. And we're not talking generalized statements. Simon is unpacking actual purchases and going into the detail of the property and the area.
160,000 people a year are moving back into Melbourne.
Second highest percentage next to WA, isn't it?
Correct.
Covering areas like Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and Melbourne.
People assume that properties in Brisbane now are completely out of reach. But recently there was a purchase in a suburb called $475,000. There's definitely really amazing opportunities in Melbourne, but a few things you have to really take into consideration.
Buying in the 400,000s in 2025 almost seems like a joke. So when I actually came up with this idea for this episode and Simon agreed to it, I was pumped. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed making it. There are some amazing locations in here and a lot of key insights from one of the most successful property investors in the country. My name's Todd Sloan. This is the Pizza and Property Podcast. Right now, let's start unpacking this list with Simon Loo. Simon Loo, how are you, man?
Good, Todd. How you going?
Very good. It's time to talk about a very popular subject right now. Something that I think a lot of people think is probably off the table and impossible, but you're about to really walk us through a list of a lot of possibilities with some strong growth potential behind them.
Yeah.
Buying in the 400,000s.
Yep.
In 2025.
Low budgets, yeah.
Yeah.
And sticking to big capital cities as well. I think that's a very important theme because there's 400k properties everywhere, right? Especially in regional areas. But as you know, I'm a big champion of big cities. I don't like regional towns too much. Yeah, it'll be interesting because a lot of people assume that 400-500k, you can't get houses, you can't get properties in big cities that don't perform anymore. But it's a complete myth.
What do you want to set the stage with before we start unpacking the list? Because we're going to be talking median house prices, rental yields, vacancy rates, and really a bit about each area and the dwellings. But what do you want to kind of start with?
Look, I think prefacing this is the natural growth cycles that we've seen since about around 2020. You know, that's when Sydney and Melbourne started booming in recent times. And then when we got to around 2017, 2018, Brisbane started booming. And then Adelaide around 2020, and then I believe WA around 21. So all these cities having experienced significant growth, unaffordability of houses have actually gone up significantly because in 2020, if you had $400,000, you could easily buy a 3 or 4 bedroom house in a standalone house in Sydney, in pockets of Melbourne, definitely in Brisbane, definitely in Perth, right? And I think we can safely assume that for most owner-occupiers, the preference is always a standalone house in Australia, right? More space, you own your own land, you can do a lot more to the house, this and that, right? And plus it's just nicer, I think, at the end of the day. So what happens is when these entry-level houses grow significantly from 300-400 to 600, 700, 800, 900, it becomes unaffordable for the average income earner. So someone earning, let's say, 100 grand a year, I wouldn't say completely unaffordable, but really starting to push the limits, in terms of how much deposit you have to put down, obviously how much interest you have to pay. And the social norm at that point is people make compromises. The first compromise, I should say, is typically location, right? So if they can't afford a specific area, they look at the next best place where they can. You know, maybe a slightly further out area or a slightly cheaper area, or maybe a completely different city altogether, right? But then the second compromise is the physicalities of the house or the property.
Yep.
So, you know, if you were to be able to buy a house and you can't anymore in a particular suburb, naturally you look at the townhouses and you look at the villas, right? And then once the townhouses and villas become unaffordable, you naturally start looking at units. So that's the hierarchy. It goes from houses, townhouses, villas, and then down to units.
This is really making me think of that whole business saying of like good, fast, and cheap.
Yeah.
You want all 3, but you only ever get 2. And it's like, it's the same kind of thing applies to real estate.
Yeah.
But maybe it's more like beautiful, close, and cheap. It's like you want it to be close, you want it to be cheap.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be very beautiful though if you want those two.
Yeah,
it's like,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So you're right in the sense that people just have to, you know, tick as many of their personal boxes as possible. But the ones they can't, they just have to live with at the end of the day. I'm going to use Brisbane as an example because Brisbane has been growing for about 7 to 8 years now, right? And it's a city that I grew my portfolio in, I'm very familiar with. And back when I was buying properties there around 2012, right through up to, even currently, I was a staunch believer of houses only, land goes up in value, buildings go down in value, and I still do. But we can't ignore the fact that once these houses that I was buying for $250,000, $230,000 in Logan, as an example, once those houses started getting to $600,000 or $700,000, during that entire time, townhouses and villas did absolutely nothing, right? And I actually owned one. One of the first properties I bought in Queensland was a little sort of 3-bed townhouse.
Is that one of those
in a
like
complex?
when they were like $150,000?
I paid $155,000 for it. And I ended up selling that in 2020. So I bought that, I think, if I remember correctly, around 2011.
Okay.
And I sold it in 2020 for $195,000.
So you were like, this sucks.
Yeah,
Like, it doesn't
it's absolute rubbish. And that is actually one of the mistakes I made. Not a massive mistake, but it was a mistake because after all that time, holding it for literally 8-9 years, however long it was,
like $40,000.
Nothing. And that was completely absorbed by, stamp duty and legal costs and, buying, selling costs and all that kind of stuff. But then around 2020, 21, townhouses and villas started taking off in Logan, right? And that was the product of these houses just becoming overly priced. And then people started, having, I guess, no choice but to start buying townhouses and villas to live in instead.
Which then shifted the competition, which then started pushing the price up.
Correct, yeah.
Got it.
And there's examples of this. Like, for example, in Logan in particular, if we look at a property, I'll give you an address. It's 6/36 Albert Street in Waterford. So this property sold in October 2021 for $231,000.
Yep.
Now, it just sold for $500,000 again, 3 years and 6 months later. So that's an example of Waterford, which is a suburb I'm extremely familiar with. Around 2021, the houses around Waterford, let's say a standard 3 or 4 bedroom house would have been, at the time, even $600,000 or $700,000. That's when people thought, oh, you know what? These houses in Waterford and Logan and blah, 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 that it's like not the greatest area. Why am I paying $700,000 for these types of properties? Let's check out some of the units. Oh, wow. Are you serious? It's only $230,000. That's a huge gap. I'm going to buy that instead. And investors were doing the same thing because $231,000 in 2021 for any property was
pretty good,
right? And the yields were a lot higher, blah, blah, blah. So that's when the shift happens. And if we can apply that shift to other cities that are currently growing, I think that's a good strategy.
So you're talking about value discrepancy, but not just value discrepancy within locations, value discrepancy within property types.
Yeah.
And being a little bit more contrarian, if I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
Basically looking at stuff that's like, okay, this might not fit the mold stereotypically of like the best property investment or the classic property investment.
Yeah.
However, the opportunity outweighs the fact that it might not have as much of a land component or the rest of it.
Yeah, correct. I think it's just social norms. It's interesting because when I grew up in Sydney, everyone had quarter-acre blocks.
Okay.
Right? If you earned even not like a median income, the norm was to buy like a quarter-acre block in some of the outer suburbs, or maybe it's just some of the middle ring suburbs that were very affordable at the time. Very few people lived in units or villas or townhouses unless maybe you were a very low-income earner or maybe it was like a personal preference. The social norm shifted, obviously, as these quarter-acre blocks became way too expensive, way too unaffordable. So people started settling for the sort of standard, those cookie cutter, 3-4 bedroom, 400, 500 square meter blocks that Masterton Homes or whatever just, kept printing out in land release areas. And they started becoming normal. And also the people that owned the quarter-acre blocks were cutting them up, into smaller blocks. Yeah, absolutely. So they were cutting it up. People realized, or maybe there was maybe a shift in people's lifestyles as well. When I grew up, it was, what you did on the weekends where you spent time in the backyards playing cricket and, all that kind of stuff. And I think, especially with social media and the internet and everything started coming on, I think that part of living became, I wouldn't say obsolete, but, you know what people do now. When they get home, they scroll on social and they're, watching YouTube and listening to podcasts as well, hopefully. So it's kind of like you kind of have to work with those social changes. Yeah. So gradually in Sydney, it became quarter-acre blocks, smaller blocks, townhouses and villas. And now units living is pretty much accepted if you're a first home buyer or if you're a young family or even if you're like an established depending on the location. And I mean, some of the units you see nowadays is crazy, right? Like, massive, all the amenities, blah, blah, blah. So the same trend happens everywhere. In Brisbane, another example, if we were to bring this up, this is the complete opposite side. This is in Moreton Bay in a suburb called Kalanga, 19/149 Duffield Road, Kalanga. It's sold in December 21 for $250,000. And it just resold 2 years and 3 months later for 520. So the property has more than doubled in value in 2 years and 3 months. Around that time, same time frame, whether you were buying in Logan or in Moreton Bay, you would have looked at the prices of the houses and go, okay, cool, this is way too expensive now. It's already doubled in value. But townhouses were so depressed. Like that gap was huge, right? So that's when you should have started buying townhouses at that time in Queensland.
So you're saying this isn't isolated, and hence the list that we're about to go through has a bit of a mixture. I think there's still some houses in there, but there's also some units, some townhouses. There's more so it's about the value discrepancy.
Correct, yeah.
Got it.
It's about the value discrepancy. It's about, houses going up first and then townhouses and villas going second.
Got it.
So, at the start of any boom cycle, if you buy houses, that's fine. That's what you should be doing, right? If they're still affordable, if the cash flow still makes sense, if they meet affordability criteria for the average income earner. But once those houses get to a certain point, it doesn't mean you need to abandon that city. You just need to abandon that type of asset in terms of the house itself, and then move on to townhouses and villas. Units, I'm still not a massive fan on, irrespective of, let's say townhouses and villas get to a point where it's super expensive as well, unless you're buying the building, unless you have the capacity to buy the whole block, and there are certain things that you can do to the block or to the building itself. And obviously if you're buying units as a block itself, you're usually getting a massive discount if you calculate the per unit cost and this and that, which is something that, as you know, that I've been doing quite a lot of. But individual units, still not sold. But townhouses, villas is a good compromise.
What if the value plays there though? Like if all of a sudden it's like the townhouse is $500,000 and the unit's still 300,000 or 250, like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
well, it could change because, like I said before, back in the early sort of 2010 to 2020, I was very staunchly against buying townhouses and villas even. It was houses only or nothing, right? But during that time, that's when I started noticing, okay, cool, there is that social shift. There is that change. Like if you bought townhouse or a villa into 2020 or 2021 in Brisbane, sorry, not 2020, 2010 or 2011, like I did, massive mistake, because you would have waited 8 or 9 years or 10 years to 2021, like these examples are showing, to see any signs of life, right?
Yeah, okay.
So you have to time it properly. You have to time the type of asset properly, not just the location.
All right, so what's the first area on the list then that fits the bill of everything that you've just really opened up?
So this is where I'm seeing that same trend happening currently in 2025, that shift from houses to townhouses and villas. And also maybe the impending shift, because we're seeing some areas where houses are starting to creep into that unaffordability bracket.
So you're talking about the Logan equivalent in 2020?
Correct.
Gotcha. Yep.
So the first example I've got is a villa out in Armadale.
Okay.
The address I can give you, it's 24/312 Strike Avenue. So Streich Avenue in Armadale.
So next to a bowling alley?
It's not spelt. Okay. Strike.
Spelling's optional for
maybe
me.
the bowling alley in maybe Germany.
Okay.
Strike sounds.
Strike.
Yeah. It's a 3-bed, 1 bath, 1 garage villa, 200 square meter block.
Okay.
There's a little bit of strata on there, $500 per week strata, which is quite common for villas anywhere really.
Was it like $2-ish grand a year?
Yeah, about $2,000 a year. But the rent is around $500 to $550 per week.
Okay.
So that on yield alone is above 6%. I think 6.5%.
So how are you getting it at 6%? Like what's this one like sort of getting purchased at value wise? Like, can you give me a bit more of the numbers that way?
Well, the purchase price was $410,000.
410. Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, if it's renting for 500, 550, that's immediately 6.5. The current value, I would say around about the 480. But I think the thing to bring home as well is the 1% vacancy rate. There's still a huge amount of rental demand in this area. So likely the rent is going to go up. Now, today, if you were to buy a similar property, a house in Armadale, you'd be looking at somewhere between 550 to 600K.
And what's that renting for? Similar kind of price?
If you buy a house for 550, 600K in Armadale, you'd be looking at the moment around about the $600 per week yield mark.
Yeah, okay. So your yield is better. Obviously, your land component isn't there the same way.
It's not there in the same way, but like I said before, I believe in Perth, we're kind of on the cusp of these sort of entry level houses, potentially creeping into the 7s and the 800Ks. And then that starts to become unaffordable for the average income earner. The hordes of people that are migrating to Perth are typically, your young professionals, your people earning 80, 90K a year, 100K a year times 2 in a household. So that transition will happen very soon, in my opinion.
And it's that price gap that really gets me. It's about really, that's the thing here, because I still remember that years ago, like in Morpeth Vale was always the suburb that comes to mind for me. It's probably because I lived there a long time ago. And it's like you could buy a house there for kind of 250, 300, or you could buy a unit there for 200 to 250.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden it was like houses were 500 to 600, but units were still like
depressed
250 to 300. And it was like that gap is now closed. And you're basically talking about the same kind of thing here.
Absolutely. Yeah. 100%. And I think eventually when these, like, just like in any city, like even Perth, like no city is like immune to that process of acceptance or compromise that people have to make if they want to stay living in that city.
Compromise probably is the exact word, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like, I'd prefer a house, but this is my situation. I'm going to compromise and we'll get a townhouse.
I mean, even if you could afford a house, you still have to compromise. When people buy houses to live in, they always want the absolute best of what they can afford, right? So even if you could afford a house in a particular suburb, let's say you had a budget of $2 million, right? But the 5-bedroom, 2-bathroom, the really nice double-story mansion with the pool, that might be $3 million. So you have to compromise. You got to get the 3-bedroom, maybe a smaller pool or something, still a house, but at $2 million, that's what you have to do. But then the further compromise down is obviously these sort of townhouses and villas that we're seeing at the moment.
I like this. And obviously you're talking about like this is a deal that you guys have put together, and 410 is awesome, but 480, it's still in the 400s.
It's in the 400s. So, a lot of buyers, a lot of investors have limited budgets. It's just the reality of, personal situations and things like that. What I'm saying is, if you have a lower budget, don't be afraid to buy townhouses and villas. If the fundamentals stack up, number one, if the city is growing and the houses in particular in that suburb that you're looking at has grown significantly, and you can see the townhouses and the villas maybe hasn't grown as much, it becomes an affordability thing that's going to drive that growth. And the other point I want to make is, if you have a low budget, you don't have to just buy in regional areas either. I think there's a lot of people out there that assume, actually I know because we get this feedback a lot. Oh, I've got a low budget. I can't buy that, 600, 700, 800K house anymore. I'm going to buy a house in a regional area instead. I would much prefer a decent townhouse or a villa in a major capital city that's growing still, rather than a house in some regional town, because you're still backed by population growth. You're still backed by supply and demand of houses or properties for people to live in. And as we've seen with Logan, if you buy at the right time, these townhouses and villas, you double your money within 2 to 3 years.
Proof's in the pudding.
Yeah. And once they double, they don't tank. They don't drop significantly either.
All right. So Armidale, what's the next one on the list?
So again, in WA, a pocket called Mandurah. Mandurah / Greenfields. Again, a lot of, if not all, listeners would be very familiar with this area.
Yep.
It's a little bit of a polarizing area as well, in the sense that, on the map, you're quite far away from Perth. You're anywhere between sort of 50 to 100 kilometers south of Perth. And if you're from Sydney or Melbourne in particular, that, 50 kilometers away from the city, you'd be on the sort of outer fringes of the city. But in Perth, culturally, it's a little bit different. And one of the reasons why Mandurah and Greenfields has grown so much is it's very, very close to water, by and large, right? So you've got the lifestyle of being very close to waterways, close to really amazing beaches. You've got amazing golf courses and world-class this and that. You've got sand dunes down in Dawesville, which a lot of people go four-wheel driving. Apparently, it's like really nice there and all that kind of stuff. So I think the appeal in these areas is you get that sort of holiday lifestyle for people moving into this area to live in. So
it's kind of like your Geelong equivalent for Victoria, maybe, or your Sellex
Geelong,
for
but
SA?
maybe with proper beaches.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't want to rubbish Geelong at all, but it's kind of like Geelong, but with better beaches.
Okay. All right.
And it's grown so much, houses in particular. In the past 4 years, because before that, this area has always had a bit of a, similar to Armidale, a little bit of a low socio feel to it. But that's rapidly changing. That's why we've been buying up so many houses there. But, this particular property is an actual house.
Okay.
Right? It's a house that I think proves that you can still buy properties in the 400K that are high growth, high in demand within the proximity of the capital city.
And you're talking like 3-bed, 1-bath.
Yeah,
Like,
the address is 63 Stinton Street, Mandurah. Bought in January this year. It's a 3-bed, 1-bath, 1 garage, 809 square meter block.
It's a
so
big
very
block.
large block.
yeah.
Rents at the moment about $530 to $560 per week. So that's around 6% yield on a house, standalone house on its own land. Vacancy rate 1%. So on a 450K purchase. Sorry, did I mention that?
No.
$450,000. This house was
450,000.
450K. So it's great. What can I say?
And is this needing work? Is this like you need to chuck another 30, 40 grand in?
Look, it's not like a house that's completely run down.
Yeah.
Right? It's livable, clean, safe and tidy. Rentable, livable from day one.
Okay.
It can probably do with a few improvements, bit of cosmetic wear and tear.
But it doesn't need them.
Doesn't need it. It is what it is. It's a typical older house on a big block, right? I own dozens of these personally, and they tend to be pretty solid once you make sure the inspections and the due diligence is pretty clean. But yeah, it's a solid little house, 450K. In my opinion, you can't really go wrong there.
So the difference between Mandurah, I know you're kind of including Mandurah and Greenfields as one.
They're similar areas, yeah.
Yep. And Armidale. So Armidale right now, you're basically saying houses have gone that far, the return has already been basically realised, that now the gap and opportunity there is potentially with townhouses.
Yeah.
But it hasn't happened there yet with Mandurah. So you're saying that it's more of a...
I still think, house, Mandurah / Greenfields and that entire sort of little pocket.
Yeah.
You should still be buying houses.
Got it. Okay.
Or around about that sort of 500K-ish mark, or 500K or maybe slightly under.
Yep.
Right. So there's clear evidence that they still exist, and they're good deals as well. I mean, I've got another one here. The address is 10 Bunyip Grove in Greenfields, and this was a March purchase, so much more into 2025. $490,000. So you're at the upper end of the 500K mark. The bank valuation was $540. However, it is a smaller house. It's a 2-bedroom house.
So it's like a homette.
Yeah, homette. Yeah. 2-bedroom, 1 bathroom, 1 car space, 458 square meter block. Rents for $500 a week. So about 5.3% or something like that. Yeah. And you still got the 1% vacancy rate. So that's kind of like on the border or on the cusp of a villa or a townhouse, because it's obviously a smaller house. It's not a massive block.
Yep.
But the next level down would be a villa or a townhouse.
So you're technically scraping into house.
Yeah.
But really, like you're saying, yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I mean, as the numbers stack up, there's, it's still a deal's a deal. I think at the end of the day. And once Mandurah and Greenfields and all these kinds of places go up, everything goes up.
And if someone's jumping on realestate.com right now, they're like Googling these addresses, they're checking out the areas, what's for sale now. Yeah. Difference between Greenfields and Mandurah. If you had to pick one, is there like a divisive, I'd go here? Or is it just no, it's the deal, they're both similar enough?
There's pockets in Mandurah which are not very desirable.
Okay.
And similarly in Greenfields that aren't desirable either. But there are pockets that are decent, and there are also pockets in Greenfields that are also decent. I always base it on the numbers, right? Again, in hindsight, looking at Logan as an example, whether you bought in Logan Lee or Waterford West, which are 2 suburbs right next to each other. Arguably, Waterford West is like a nicer looking suburb in terms of the type of houses that are there.
Yep.
But the only thing anyone wishes is that they bought more. Back whether it was in Logan Lee or Waterford, it wouldn't have mattered. The only thing that mattered at the time was whether you were getting a good deal, which enables you to buy the next one. I wouldn't have any prejudice, between one suburb or the other.
Can I just tangent for a sec? And we'll get back to the list, I promise. What do you think is the biggest thing that actually holds people back from this? Because not only you do it, you walk the talk very much, you build a huge portfolio, but you see it day in, day out, you're staring at the coalface of indecision pretty constantly. What if there's one thing people can work on within themselves? Because I know that some people are going to be looking at this list and going, yes, and they're going to be moving forward. Yeah. Some people are going to be looking at this list and going, yeah, it's pretty good, and then nothing's going to change.
Yeah.
What's the thing that people really need to take away from that to move forward, to have the confidence to do you know what I mean?
I've said this from day dot.
Yeah.
Be unemotional. You have to be unemotional. The reason why people don't buy in Mandurah is they look at the map and go, that's too far south, right?
Okay.
But they don't apply the cultural nuances, perhaps, that Perth has over, say, Sydney and Melbourne. Because one of the things that people love to do in Perth is to be not near the city. In Sydney and Melbourne, people love to be as close to the city as possible, right? But in Perth, or perhaps the people that choose to live in Perth over Sydney and Melbourne, they desire more that sort of lifestyle, nicer weather, less traffic, stress-free beaches, amazing beaches up and down the coast, right? Yep. But still in proximity to the city, right? If obviously they need to commute to work and all that kind of stuff.
So it's still in the mix, it's just not at the front.
You can't apply your own prejudices, your own preferences, your own stereotypes into what you invest in with properties, right? So, and that goes for not just the location, but also in this case, smaller houses, villas, townhouses, smaller blocks. Block size is a very, very common one that we get daily, right? Like if I send a lot of property on a 300 square meter block to clients or to buyers, a lot of them would say no. I don't want it because the block's too small. I want something different. Okay. But we've just proven, the performance of some of these villas and properties on smaller blocks, older houses, another one that a lot of people have issues with. Oh, it's too old. Even though it's fine, but it's too old. They go up. They make tons and tons of money. So you're saying no to money just because you wouldn't live in there. You wouldn't consider that people have different lifestyles or different necessities, I guess, to you.
So what I'm hearing is if you're listening to this right now and you're actually unfortunately really resonating with, I've been sitting on the fence for too long. I've been in that sort of indecision camp for way too long. It's sounding like the thing that you need to really start asking yourself is what are those personal preferences and emotional decisions that I'm actually making that are potentially holding me back? Yeah. And obviously everyone's financial situation is different and you have to make a decision based on your own. But I want to see the messages coming in a year's, 2 years time of people going, we bought those properties that some people were saying were no good, but we could see exactly what Simon was saying. The value play was there. It totally made sense. It's something that I think is so important to actually take action, to move forward. All right. So what's area number 4, man?
Look, I'm bringing it back to Brisbane.
Okay.
Bringing it back to Queensland, a lot of people assume that properties in Brisbane now are completely out of reach, and rightly so. It's the second most expensive city now in Australia. But recently there was a purchase in a suburb called Bellbird Park, which is in the Ipswich LGA. It's actually quite a decent looking suburb. It's a suburb that has quite a large owner-occupier mix. It's not one of the more sort of older, lower socio areas in Ipswich. And there was a house at 9 Millica Court in Bellbird Park.
9 Millica Court.
Sold in February. $475,000.
What was wrong with it?
In Brisbane. It needed a little bit of work. It needed a bit of a cosmetic reno, around $15K.
That sounds stupid cheap.
It's a 3-bed, 1-bath, 753 square meters block of land. Once everything was said and done with the reno, $550 per week rental, around 6% rental yield. Okay. And the vacancy rate is less than 1%. So 0.8% vacancy rate.
I got to ask, is this a unicorn or is this standard? Because this sounds...
It's a pretty good deal, but surprisingly, it's one of those deals that a lot of people say no to. Because, when you look at it, doing the inspections and the due diligence and so on, like I said, it needed a reno. Okay. Right? But a lot of people look at a house and they overestimate how much work it actually needs. Right? So for example, if you go through a house and there's holes on walls, right? To patch the holes and repaint the wall, it's not a big deal. If you do that for several walls in the house or even the entire house, there's a number to it, maybe $5,000 or something, right? A lot of people look at a kitchen, maybe missing cupboards and it's scuffed and this and that. Again, it might not be a massive deal. Replace the doors, sand down if it's wood, sand it down and repaint it and this and that. There are cheap ways that you can spruce up a property without having to do a 50, 60K reno, to change everything.
And that's if you're not going for the whole massive revow, trying to completely revamp it, there's no point spending that much money.
And perhaps a lot of people have a lot of fear about doing it. Yeah. But, if you've got the right trades, you don't even need the right trades. If you just get a few quotes and, if you don't want to do it yourself, it's a good thing to learn. It's something that's a necessity, if you're starting to buy and build a large portfolio of properties. So, this house, $475,000, so much value in it. I would say after reno, you'd be worth around about the 570-ish mark, about 100K-ish equity. If you had to spend 10, 15K on it.
Pretty good uplift.
And even after the reno, you're still on the 500K, or on the dot, basically. So it's another example that, within the 400s or 400 to 500K mark, there's still deals in
Brisbane.
In Brisbane. That's a house as well, not a townhouse or a villa, but a proper house. Especially if you're thinking a little bit laterally as well. Obviously this house needs a little bit of work, but not the end of the world at the end of the day. And it's proof that you don't just have to make that compromise, I guess you can say, to townhouses or villas.
Got it.
So yeah.
Okay. And Belbert Park, how many Ks from the city?
28 Ks.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not like
30 minutes.
Yeah.
35 minutes, something like that.
So we're not talking 40, 50 Ks away.
No.
Yeah, it's actual Brisbane.
Good areas, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we're moving away from sunny Queensland.
Yep.
Next on the list is
sunny Adelaide. At times.
He says as it's raining outside.
Well, it has its charm, I was saying this the other day, but Adelaide, I kind of like Adelaide when it rains. It suits
it's nice.
The feel of the area.
Adds a bit of charm.
Yeah, exactly. Elizabeth Park, the Elizabeth Salisbury area has been, again, one of these sort of, you live here, so you probably know better than myself.
I'm familiar with it.
It's not like a super low socio, especially when you consider other low socio areas around Australia, in other capital cities. But it's an area that I think is heavily undervalued compared to the rest of Adelaide. And it's inevitably, eventually, it's going to gentrify. It's going to go through that same thing that Logan did, and, a lot of these Armadales and Manduras and so on are also doing.
I actually think what you were saying before, this is a perfect example of it. Because you know what the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think of Elizabeth Park?
What's that?
I used to have a little candy machine business years ago.
Okay.
Right? And this is a whole nother story. And I remember the first time I had some placed out at Elizabeth Park. Elizabeth is actually really big, like Playford.
Yeah.
And I remember the first time like driving out there, and I hadn't been there because I grew up down south, not out north. And I just looked to my left and there was a guy running through a paddock holding a 50-inch flat screen. I don't think he was taking his TV for a walk. But
maybe he loves. Look, you can't judge people, man.
Anyway, my point is though, I can judge. I do judge. We all judge.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
But like you were saying,
he was probably just moving houses or something.
Just really enthusiastic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're just going to a mate's house and he doesn't have a TV and they want to watch a game. Like, haven't you seen that before?
Not at that speed. No.
Okay, cool. Well, it was about to start. Didn't want to miss.
But my point of it is, I know how well this area is already done.
Yeah.
I can see the fundamentals, what you and I have been talking about off air before this as well. I can see the direction that it's potentially going in.
Yeah.
So it's about me even having that prejudice, but letting go of it, because it's like, again, be unemotional. You're an investor here. Yeah. You're not looking at, is this the place I want to live?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, eventually people will live and it'll be the new normal, just like any other place that's accepted today, as in what would be considered middle class, I guess you can say. Once upon a time, they were the Elizabeths. They were the Logans. They were the Manduras and Armadales. And, through gentrification and the new demographics coming through, that's when these that's when these areas become more livable. So this particular property, 7 Liverpool Place, Elizabeth Park, $440,000 purchase price. It's a 3-bed, 1 bath, 1 garage, 277 square meter block, 14 years old, so fairly new. 440K purchase price. It revalued at 580K already.
How long between purchase and vow? Because that's such a huge jump.
About 3 months.
Yeah, right.
The rent's $500 a week, about 6% rental yield. Strata, there is a little bit of strata in this one, $102 per quarter only.
May as well be nothing.
Yeah.
It's basically an ESL.
This is a very common type of villa we find in South Australia and also in Perth, where they actually look and feel like houses. They're in this community. It's not gated or anything, but there is a little bit of strata that looks after common roads, driveways.
$400 a year, it's pretty negligible.
Maybe like some sort of common sort of lawn mowing around the streets and so on. So I think that's an important point to make, because I think a lot of people assume villa or townhouses to be in those massive complexes where there's one driveway that goes in and you're living on top of each other. It can be that. There's nothing wrong with it. But it can also be pretty much like a house where you just pay a little bit of body corporate. So Vacancy rate in Elizabeth Park at the time of recording is around about 1.1%. It's extremely low vacancy rate, so that rent is probably going to go up as well. But that's another example of a property that is a good deal in a good area in terms of an area that's can only gentrify. I can't really imagine, and I don't think you can either, somewhere like Elizabeth Park becoming less than $440,000 for a 3-bedroom property.
No, not at all.
The numbers stack up, the yield stacks up, and yeah, it's a good little keeper. A good little property that you can leverage up into buying more houses as well.
All right, and so still buying in the 4s,
Yeah.
but what's like the median house price?
Median house price in Elizabeth Park at the moment is, I think, around about the 520 mark, something like that.
520
Yeah.
mark. Okay.
So definitely below median. You got a property that looks and feels like a house. Yeah, it's a small block, but it's actually a pretty big block considering it's a villa. So yeah, I don't see anything wrong with that at all.
There's one of the things with villas, like 50 square meters when you're talking about like 620 and 670 doesn't usually mean that much.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about 220 or 270,
It makes a difference.
Huge difference.
100%.
It's having
Same
a
with prices, right? So at this level, the difference between a 450K house and a 500K house is night and day. But at $1 million, it's like one bid at auction, so yeah, you have to adjust as well, you're a lot more sort of sensitive in the lower price point areas.
So last on the list, we're going over to Victoria.
Melbourne, everyone's favorite topic at the moment. A bit of a polarizing city, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you've got some thoughts on this.
I mean, we're buying good deals, right? There's definitely really amazing opportunities in Melbourne because it's such a depressed market at the moment. But a few things you have to really take into consideration. It has grown for 10 years, except for the past 3 or 4, right? And it stopped growing for very artificial reasons, the land taxes and all that kind of stuff that's in place. And because of that, all these people have left Melbourne, investors. They had no choice but to sell up because they can't afford it anymore. The biggest problem I have with Melbourne at the moment is the cash flow, the yields. They're just absolutely rubbish. Doesn't matter if you're buying north, south, east, west, Frankston, Werribee, Melton, Broadmeadow, Sunshine, inner city, it doesn't matter. The yields are just absolutely rubbish, right? So if you can't afford the cash flow, don't buy Melbourne is probably my advice.
I think that's a pretty fair comment.
Yeah. If you can afford it, if you've got a large portfolio, if you're a very high income earner that's giving, all these kinds of things, there's some really good bargains. There's some really good deals, and population flow and growth, that's all happening as well at the moment. I think 160,000 people a year are moving back into Melbourne.
It's like the second highest percentage next to WA, isn't it?
Yes,
the increase,
percentage-wise, yeah, correct. So all the sort of base fundamentals stack up, but just be a little bit careful and scrutinize the deal, very, very closely as well.
In what way? What do you think people are getting wrong?
Making sure you're not overpaying.
So again, they're emotional.
Making sure you're not getting caught up in the hype, the investor hype. A lot of people. Melbourne is also one of those cities where I think people romanticize in the sense that it's a global city, right? Similar to Sydney. It's a city that a lot of people around the world recognizes. And I think just the social dynamics of being in Australia, Sydney and Melbourne, at least in recent history, has always been considered like the leaders, the best cities, so to speak.
Whenever you go overseas and they hear the Aussie accent, they're always like, oh, you're from Sydney or Melbourne.
Correct. So this is kind of like a window of opportunity for anyone to go, oh man, I can own a house or can own a property in, shiny, glamorous Melbourne.
Yeah.
I'll just buy it. Doesn't matter, that kind of a thing. So you got to be very careful about that. But what Melbourne reminds me a lot of, especially the lower socio, maybe the up and coming gentrifying areas, is similar to what I experienced out in Logan, so many years ago. Because the vacancy rates in some of these sort of outer areas are seemingly quite high. But similarly in Logan, the vacancy rates between 2015 and 2020 was somewhere between 3 and 5%.
Yeah, they were massive.
Massive, right? For some reason, I never had a problem with my rentals.
Did you always purposely under rent a touch just to keep?
Whatever the market rent was at the time, was what I rented it. I never had a problem with houses going vacant for months and whatever. I don't remember having to drop rent significantly either.
Okay.
So the examples that I've pulled up are in another polarizing area, which is an area called Melton, which should get some interesting comments.
I can already see the mixed bag right now.
But when we're talking, obviously, houses that are, or properties that are 400 to 500K, to be able to buy a house still within the confines of a capital city like Melbourne, I think you can't ignore that. And I think is a clear sign that, again, I can't really see these areas becoming less. I can only see them becoming more. Right.
Coming back to what you were saying about Perth before, like $250,000, it's like it's below replacement cost.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's affordability at the end of the day, right? In major capital cities, everyone needs houses. Whether you're a millionaire or whether you're someone just scraping by, you need a house to live in. And, you know, as investors, like I said before, you can't be prejudiced to one particular demographic and dismiss another. But from my experience as well, these are the areas that tend to make the most money in terms of percentage growth, because, you know, these 400,000-500K houses, when they become 700, 800 or 900K at some point in time, it happens a lot quicker and it happens a lot more likely in terms of the percentage growth.
What do you mean it happens a lot more likely?
At 900K, it's affordable, relatively, right? 800K, relatively affordable.
So you're saying if you buy the 800, 900Ks, then all of a sudden you're needing that to turn into 1.4, 1.6.
Correct,
like that.
Yeah. So it's, you know, I believe that's one of the main reasons why Logan grew so much, you know, because at 200K,
so affordable.
300K was ridiculous. Yeah. But even at 600 or 700K, you know. Still
works.
Yeah. For most people looking for just, you know, entry level house to live in or whatever, they can go, okay, cool. 600-700K is something someone earning $90,000 a year, $70,000 a year can even afford. You know, so yeah, that's definitely why I'm kind of looking at some of these areas, not just Melton, but, you know, other areas like Broadmeadows and Frankstons and the Werribes and a lot of these sort of outer fringe areas that are clearly still affordable.
But the thing about Melton though is buying property in the 4s and 5s is still very doable.
Doable, 100%.
Like this isn't just like one random property that you got 200K under or anything crazy, is it?
No, I mean, the example, 7 Finlay Avenue in a suburb called Harkness, 510,000. So just slightly above the 500K mark. Okay. 3-bed, 2-bath, 1-car space, 300 square meter block, 14 years old. So fairly new. And coming back to what you said, you wouldn't be able to build this again. You know, in today's money, even if you got the land for free, I doubt you'd be able to build a 3-bedroom property for.
And 3-bed, 2-bath too.
500,000, yeah. And it's double story. Vacancy rate is around 2.5%. So it's not low.
Hence what you were saying before.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yep.
Yeah. So again, an example where you can buy a standalone property, standalone house. Now, this is kind of like on the cusp of what I mentioned before as well, because at some point, I think townhouses and villas, maybe not particularly in Melton, but in other areas, say Frankston, where if you were to buy a standard house out there, it's like 700, 800K now, at 900K even. Frankston might be a good option to start looking at townhouses and villas, because townhouses and villas in Frankston, from memory, are, let's say, around about the 500K mark. They rent for about $500 a week.
So about 5% yield.
Yeah. Yep. And if you compare that gap to houses, which are $300,000-$400,000 more in some cases, I think that discrepancy can't be ignored.
I feel like you've just chucked in a freebie area then, mate.
Frankston?
Yeah. Frankston for townhouses.
I'm not sure if it's a secret. But yeah, that's an example, of something that's still around, relatively affordable.
Yep.
Yeah. And then another one, again, in Melton South, 9 Yeoman, Yeoman Street. I think this one's this one's slightly more, $530,000 purchase price, but it's a 4-bedroom house. 4-bed, 2-bath, 1 garage, 300 square meter block, only 3 years old.
4-bed, 2-bath, basically new.
3 years old. It's as good as new. I think it's better than new, because after 3 years, it's just old enough for anyone to go, okay, did they build this properly?
Settled.
Yeah, exactly. Because at the moment, a lot of brand new houses, very quickly, a lot of people are finding some pretty nasty surprises.
Yeah.
Things falling apart and, the slab wasn't done properly and things are cracking and this and that. Like, I see it all the time. People assume that newer houses are better. In my experience, it's actually the opposite. The stuff that's maybe 10, 20 years old, I find those actually super, super secure, especially if they're not damaged or cracking or anything like that, because those are the houses that will probably last another 20 years.
Yep.
As long as you maintain it and upkeep it. But the big ticket items like, structural defects and things like that, 3 years is a good time frame, I think, to kind of go, okay, cool, this house has been around long enough.
And I feel like I need to point out here, 530,000, obviously we're above the 400K mark here, but realistically, that's a 4-bed, 2-bath. We're talking a large family home. So still buying in the 400s, incredibly achievable if you're talking more like...
I want to say large family home. It's
can't be that small if it's a 4 and 2.
Look, there wasn't a floor plan. Right. And if I look at the block, 300, about 294, 300 square meters, the house basically covers most of the block. So I think it's safe to assume that it's, maybe around about the 200 square meter mark.
So that's a lot. And this is my point.
Yeah.
That's a lot of house for 530.
Yeah.
So if you are investing more so in like 3-in-1s, 110 square meters, you're absolutely in the floors.
Yeah, they're around. They're available. Rent's about $480 per week, coming back to the whole sort of Melbourne problem of having low yields.
That's not an exciting rental return.
It's not at all. The vacancy rate is actually even higher at the time of recording for Melton South, which is around about the 4.5%.
Yep. Okay.
So not great, but it's more of a long-term in the future kind of a play, similar to what I mentioned about Logan before.
For memory, because I bought in Logan like 2020. You've been buying there for like a decade before I got anything there. Rents were already looking pretty good when I got in. Yeah. Rents when you got in were what? Like you're paying $250, you're renting it out for $300 a week, that kind of thing?
$350, yeah, $300, $350.
$300, $350. Okay, so the yields were better though.
The yields were better, but this is the thing about yields. At that price point, even if you get 7 or 8% yields, because a lot of costs of maintaining properties are the same, whether you have a $200 or $1,000 or $800,000 property.
Oh, yeah, this,
it's not. You have to look at the dollar cash flow, not just a yield. The percentage yield is a guide, I would say. So, a 6% rental yield on a $300,000 property versus 6% rental yield on a $900,000 property in terms of actual cash, actual cash flow is completely different, right? So, for me, some of these Logan properties that I bought so many years ago were yielding 7%. I was probably pocketing $50 a week after everything's said and done, if I was lucky. So, at the time it was a lot more meaningless, I guess, just looking straight up at the yield.
Okay. So coming back to what you were saying about Victoria then, because I know there's going to be a lot of people checking out Melton now. There's going to be a lot of love, a lot of hate. There'll be a real mixed bag on this one.
Yeah.
But what you were saying before, it sounded like it was kind of, if this is your first investment, maybe it's something to be a little bit more wary of. But if you've already got a few, is that kind of what you were...
Yeah, don't fall into the trap of the love affair, I guess you can say, of owning a house in Melbourne, right? Number 2, yes, if you are starting out and your goal is to build a large portfolio or a decent sized portfolio of properties, Melbourne's probably not the best place to be, in my opinion, because of that cash flow. Because if you buy one of these houses, even in an area like Melton, yes, super affordable. But if it's already costing you $200 off the bat, in negative cash flow.
You can't hold many of them.
Not only can you not hold any of them, but how long can you hold on to that one property for? If it's hemorrhaging your back pocket every week, every month, every year, And Melbourne is in a state where there are some signs of life, but you still can't ignore the land tax. You still can't ignore all these factors that's currently keeping it where it is.
Yep.
And you also can't ignore the fact that it's already grown since 2010 to about 2020 or 2021 when it's completely sort of stalled. My fear is that you might be waiting slightly longer to see some meaningful growth, meaning houses just doubling in value within the space of 5 years. Bit of a caveat there, if you're buying in Melbourne, make sure you understand the risk of the cash flow.
All right, man. So we've got 6 places on the list. Some houses, some townhouses.
Yeah.
Townhouses very much you're through that lens of the value discrepancy has to be there. This isn't so much that you're now pro townhouse. This is your pro opportunity.
Correct, 100%.
Got it. Some houses, I got to say, the biggest one that was a surprise for me is the Belbert Park, $475 for a house. I know it needs a bit of work, but that's a hell of a deal.
Yeah.
Across 3 different states, some areas we've talked about before, some are pretty new on the list. And Melbourne, by the sounds of things, a little bit more of a warning. It's opportunity, but it's an opportunity with an asterisk, if I've really understood you right.
Yeah, currently, yes. That can change very rapidly.
Yep.
Unlikely, but who knows? New government might put in, go, you know what, stuff the land tax, welcome back everyone. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. But for now, be a little bit cautious. There are some amazing deals on the ground. Really good below market value. Yields, you can't escape that. Whether you're buying in premium, non-premium, Melton, North, South, East, West, like I said before, you're going to get pretty rubbish cash flow.
Yeah.
So make sure you can afford it. Make sure it's not going to impact how much you can borrow as well for the next one. Because that's another problem with very heavy negative cash flow properties is the banks are going to scrutinize that when you go for your next loan. And you need to think, is this deal that I'm getting in Melbourne worth not being able to buy more properties potentially down the track? So that's something else to consider as well. I guess the point of this episode is houses in major capital cities or properties in major capital cities between 400 to 500K, maybe slightly more, still exist. And they're good opportunities. They're in very high growth areas, gentrifying areas as well. So, you know, if your budget's a little bit more limited, don't despair. There's definitely still opportunities out there.
I love it, man. So what's an action step? What's something that someone can pull out their headphones right now or push pause and put into place right now if they want to start walking down this path of actually getting something in the 400s right now, 25?
The action step is the same as what I've been saying in this episode and for many, many years, right? Unemotional. Stay unemotional. Don't include your own personal prejudices, stereotypes, preferences. Be cautious. You know, it's not about seeing a place that is completely unlivable or I go, oh, wow, I need to be unemotional. I need to buy that. You know, you still need to think of the fundamentals, make sure the numbers stack up.
Detroit house for $1,000.
Yeah. They don't exist anymore, I don't think.
I don't know.
It's another episode. But yeah, just focus on the numbers, you know, focus on what you want to achieve with property. Investing in property is purely to make money. You peel away everything else. It's not to make you feel good. It's not to help you brag to your friends and family about owning, you know, a bunch of properties or houses in particular areas or anything like that, right? And if it ticks the boxes of making money, whether we're looking at some polarizing sort of low socio areas or maybe a property type that you may not be super comfortable with, like a townhouse or a villa or a smaller house, if the numbers stack up, they still make good money. So yeah.
I always thought that was something that got people with off-the-plan apartments. Just purely the shininess of the marketing.
It's the shininess of the marketing, but it's also, I think, the brag factor.
Yeah.
You know, I think that a lot of people at the Sunday barbecues, they, you know, properties are at some point is always going to come up. Oh, you know, I just bought in that new development, you know, in that fancy suburb.
It's got a smeg oven.
Yeah,
Look at this
you know,
view.
second stage, this and that. Like and, you know, the developer threw in all these extras and blah, blah, blah. Quite honestly, I think that's, you know, as much as people don't like to admit it, I think a lot of people do buy properties just like anything else that a lot of people buy just to impress other people. You know, it's not really there to achieve passive income goals or early retirement or whatever you want to call it.
It's kind of interesting then. If you can look past the status in the early days, you've got a better chance of creating actual status.
When I had 12 Logan dumps, you know, I can admit now, people thought I was crazy. You know, when I told them about it, it wasn't like, oh, wow, Simon owns 12 properties. So amazing. It was like,
what's wrong with Simon?
Yeah, what's wrong with him? Why are you buying all these, you know, crappy houses that people don't want to live in crappy areas? So yeah, just stick to the game, stick to the strategy. You know, don't sway from it. Don't get emotional. If you want to impress people, make some money first and then impress them properly.
Mate, well, it brings us to the most important question that I've asked you before. I'm going to ask you again right now because it's our first chat, I think, in 25. What is your favorite pizza? Simon Loo. I didn't say your name then. Simon Loo, what is your favorite pizza?
Well, it's actually a good timely question because last night I was at a place in Adelaide called Bank Street Social, and this is not a plug, but I had a really good pepperoni pizza there.
Okay.
So, and I didn't add the honey. Honey was an extra option. I thought honey was a little bit...
Is it the chili honey?
I don't have no idea what it was.
Because it's actually pretty good.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, well, then we'll get
if it's the chili honey.
Maybe I'll grab another one after this.
Yeah.
But that was a really good pizza. So pepperoni at the moment.
Pepperoni at the moment. Mate, if they're open for lunch, I reckon you and I got to grab a bite anyway. But
right. I think we earned it.
Yeah. Simon Loo, this has been an awesome episode, and I genuinely thank you for actually pulling back the curtain on a lot of this, because a lot of people in your industry don't want to talk as much specifics.
Yeah.
So being able to actually go not only here's some locations down to the suburb level, down to the here's actual addresses. This is going to help a lot of people as far as understanding what they've got to work with. And maybe some people that even thought, I can only get approved for 400, 500. I'm done. I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
And now actually going to be in a position to go, cool, I actually think I can possibly move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I hope you guys got value of that.
Awesome. Simon Loo, thank you as always, mate.
No worries.